So good afternoon and warm welcome to everyone who has joined us today. My name is PIYUSH TIWARI and I'm professor in Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. My apologies for starting a bit late. There were some technical glitches. We are still sorting that out. As you can see that Sam Murphy is trying to connect and hasn't been able to do so. But we'll meanwhile begin our discussion, and as and when Sam joins in, he will participate. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on today, the Wurundjeri people, as well as traditional owners of land you are situated on, and acknowledge that Indigenous Australians have been custodian of lands and waterways in Australia for thousands of years. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As part of State of Industry webinar series, today we'll be talking about retirement villages of the future post-COVID-19. There are a few housekeeping things. We would welcome your questions, so please post your questions through Q&A tab on your screen. Simon Elcleb, my colleague, who will be working in the background, would be sorting those questions and would pass those on to us to respond to. By way of introduction, we have two panelists. One of them you can see on the screen, Andrew Phillip. Andrew is co-founder and managing director of RCA Village, a retirement village development and operating business, which operates 10 retirement villages around Melbourne, which comprises a total of about 2,000 ILUs. He has wealth of experience in this sector. The other panelist is Sam Murphy, who is partner with Knight Frank and has 3 decades of experience in property and business valuation. He leads a national team of valuers and other experts in the healthcare and retirement village sector. With aging demographics, the options for accommodation of senior Australians have evolved significantly. 1 in 6 Australian is aged 65 and over today, and in 25 years, 1 in 5 will be above 65. Changing housing preferences of seniors in last 10 years have led to a huge increase in independent living units. There are about 175,000 independent living units in Australia, where about 225,000 seniors live. In terms of penetration rate is the share of seniors who live in these ILUs is about 6%, and it's going to change in the years to come. So we would be discussing today, what is the status of retirement villages going forward in the near future and in the long term. Andrew, maybe I'll pass this question on to you, though till we wait for Sam to join in. There is some kind of confusion in the terms retirement village and aged care. Could you tell us what the difference is? And when we talk about retirement village, what do we mean by retirement village?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Posh. Welcome, everybody. It's nice to have you on the broadcast. So in Australia, the two terms, retirement village and aged care facility, they're regulated differently, and in a physical sense, they are different points in life. So retirement village is generally for people who are still living independently, and so they're more in a campus environment, either a vertical village, which multi-level village, which would be an apartment style of independent living, or a horizontal village, which is broadacre, single level village, perhaps with or each of them with a clubhouse with facilities including lounges, dining facilities, club rooms, swimming pool, gymnasium, those sort of facilities, and also facilities that accommodate visiting health professionals. So it's generally, retirement villages are generally for people in the range of 55 through to really anything up to say 85, but probably on average the age would be around 70, 75. aged care facilities, which is not what we do. That's regulated in Australia at the Commonwealth level, and it's really what you described historically as nursing homes or old age homes. It's more and more become a campus for people who are nearing the end of their life or are physically or mentally impaired and incapable of looking after themselves. We did used to have aged care facilities that had what we called low care and high care. It's now just one level of aged care, and it's more in the nature of high care. So it's 24/7 nursing care is available. So that's an aged care facility. It's not what we do, and perhaps not what we're particularly talking about today, but the two do often get confused. But today we're talking about independent living retirement villages, and some people call them lifestyle villages as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think that makes it very clear, distinction between the two. May I ask you, what role do retirement villages play in the living ecosystem of senior Australians?
Yeah, sure, Push. I guess the role that, as I see it, is it's addressing both physical and mental health needs, providing a gated community. So the sort of factors that draw people into a retirement village, mostly it's a need driven rather than a desire driven, I would say. Perhaps a little bit changing these days, but people that are looking for a little bit of support, either through, they've been a bit more isolated, their neighbourhood's changed, the people have moved out of their street, younger families have moved in, they're feeling a bit isolated. They might be moving there to get a little bit of support in a community sense, perhaps some allied health assistance within the clubhouse facilities. And so the village provides this venue, this community, and it's about providing community and community support. And I've always likened retirement villages to small country towns. If you've ever lived or been in a small country town, people just look after each other in a small country town. They're very tight-knit communities. And it doesn't mean you get on with everyone in the community, but you learn to live with each other and help each other out. And there's a lot of benefits in that in terms of in a retirement village, there's a lot of bulk buying opportunities where residents can access, power, electricity, gas, all sorts of services on a bulk purchase basis. So there's economic a role to be played in providing a lower cost of living. It also provides a role in letting people downsize and release some equity from their traditional family home. Typically someone moving to a retirement village might be selling their family home of 40, 50, 60 years where they've been rattling around on their own, or as a couple, the kids have long moved out. They release the equity out of that and they might move into a retirement village unit that's half the size and perhaps half the price, which enables them to pocket, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 or more to supplement their pension income or their government pension that they're living off. So it has many, many roles, but essentially from a personal perspective, it's about health and well-being, and financial perspective about releasing equity in order to then supplement, cost of living in older age.
Right. Another question which is related here is that there is always a debate between aging in place and downsizing and moving to a bespoke retirement villages. Are these two complementary in the sense that do they go hand in hand, whether one can age in place while being in retirement villages, or is this totally different concept? Is the debate somewhere settling?
No, look, I think it's very clear in my mind. They are totally complementary. Someone that moves into retirement villages is just moving home. They're still living independently. The difference really is they're within a gated community or a secured community, a secure, physically secured community. However, as they age, it's very common for retirement village residents to start bringing care services into their home, just like they might have done in their old home, before they moved into the village. So, I'll see district nurse cars coming and going quite often in our villages, and it's really just our older residents perhaps got someone coming in to help with anything from maintenance jobs around their villa, right through to perhaps helping them bathe or feed them within their retirement village home. So, you know, they're totally complementary. In fact, there's enormous efficiencies to bring those in-home care services, which are more in the nature of aged care services, to bring those services into a retirement village environment, because if you like, the nurse or the service provider coming into the home to provide in-home care services can service perhaps 5 or 10 people on the one campus. They might spend an hour getting someone up and bathed in the morning. They might then move to you know, a villa next door and help someone with breakfast. And then they might just be providing company to someone at another villa, you know, play chess or take them out to the shops. So where people are ageing in place in our villages, it's really no different to ageing in place in a traditional suburban home. In fact, it's probably a more efficient way and safer way to age in place within a retirement village.
There's a question coming from one of the participants. He's asking, since you mentioned gated community, why is there a requirement for a gated style community when connectivity with the surrounding community and different demographics could benefit everyone?
Yeah, so the gated part of a gated community really is about security, or the perception of security. Many people, you know, 60, 70 years old, feel increasingly, I wouldn't say fearful, that's a bit of an overstatement, but insecure in their physical environment. You know, their streets change, you know, there's younger families, maybe, you know, maybe a few hoons zooming up and down their street. They can move away from that environment into a gated community, so that the gates are open, you know, really most of the time. They might only close, you know, between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, but that gives the residents a real sense of security. And that is a prime rationale and reason why people move into a village. You know, security is probably one of the most top reasons why people move. And it doesn't mean that they're not engaged with the outside community. In fact, it's quite the obvious opposite. You know, we'll often get schools coming into the retirement villages. You know, they might come in, especially around Christmas, to provide, you know, they might bring their choir in. There's a lot of intergenerational activities that our village managers organise, and our residents, in fact, organise to bring their grandchildren and the community of children and multi-age groups into the retirement village for all sorts of reasons. And it might be to, you know, bring the kids in to teach them about gardening. You know, you've got a lot of people in a village who have got time, and they love to volunteer and help people, you know, particularly younger people. So there's an enormous amount of interaction that goes on, intergenerational interaction that goes on between the gated community inside the village and people living in the general community outside the village. Really, the gate is just there, in my mind, just for overnight security primarily.
Yeah. I do see that in the retirement villages which are near where I live, that there's a lot of interaction with the children going in, and also the community interacting with them. So there is another question which is from the participants. This is about downsizing and the effect of downsizing. Does downsizing affect their pension if they end up with cash in the bank? Is the question which somebody is trying to ask.
Generally not. It's a little bit complicated, but in Australia anyway, they have both an asset test and an income test, which will then dictate the amount, if any, of government pension you might receive. And it is a little bit of an issue. Generally, if I look going back some years, you know, most people in retirement villages would have been on a government pension, and pretty much a full pension. These days, if you took an average across a cohort of village residents in Australia, I'd say it's a lot less now. Many people are now either on only a part government pension or no pension at all, and they're living off their own superannuation. And I mean, back in the, I'll get it wrong, but back in the 80s or 90s, Australia introduced compulsory superannuation contributions. So over the last 20, 30 years, Australian citizens have been building up their own private superannuation funds And so that's seen a move away from total reliance on government pension and more towards superannuation fund annuities and so on, and maybe supplemented in some cases by a full or part pension. And the part pension, yes, would be in some way governed by the level of assets they own and their income that they own in retirement, that they earn in retirement. So I think that it'll vary from country to country, but it's less of an issue these days in retirement villages than it perhaps was, given people now have some form of self-funded retirement as well as government pension funding.
All right, okay, thank you very much. There's a question on the services in the retirement village. In terms of providing home care, is that coordinated by the retirement housing operator?
No, home care these days comes under the aged care regulation and regime. That's Commonwealth funded in Australia. So home care it's personal directed care. So these days the Commonwealth funding goes to the individual, and then the individual then chooses what services they want to buy with that funding, whether it's someone to take them out to the shops at one extreme, or perhaps someone to actually get them out of bed, bathe them, feed them, and so on at the other extreme. And in-home care is an alternative these days, and in fact an encouraged alternative to moving into residential aged care. And as I think I was saying to you earlier, PIYUSH, we're seeing more of these in-home care services now coming into our villages. And because it's really, they're living in their home, they're entitled to, and it's an efficient way to receive that in-home care within their retirement village villa. But it's organised by the individuals, and the funding goes directly from the Commonwealth Government to those individuals within the village. Look, it's not to say that our village manager doesn't keep an eye out, and in our villages we actually have an active health coordinator who can probably predict and foresee which residents are going to need some level of care in the next 3, 4, 6 months and so on. And in those circumstances, our village staff would help and facilitate the receipt of aged care, in-home care services for our residents. So there is an involvement just in coordinating it, but not in the funding or in being responsible for it.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt. Just a quick note on my end. I have Sam on my phone here, and he's on speakerphone, so he will be part of the conversation this way. So, PIYUSH, please feel free to address him as well, and I'll make sure that hopefully the sound on my end works fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's great. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Sorry about this. I'm not quite sure what's happened.
No, it's perfectly fine as long as you can hear us well.
Yes, I can.
There is a question coming in, Sam. Maybe I will direct that to you. So is there evidence that retirement villages, lifestyle retirement villages, benefit the communities in which they are situated? If so, are there economic and social benefits?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting question. Certainly anecdotally, a lot of people have, a lot of villages have, and residents have commented on the benefits that are available to residents coming into villages. Certainly, one of the drivers into villages that we are aware of is the isolation. One of the key drivers is perhaps loss of a partner and a sense of isolation, so that when people enter villages, they're more connected with a like community. And that has the benefits of an active social and a lifestyle that engages in activities, physical activities, and access to things that are beneficial, like a lot of villages will run various personal training or, aqua aerobics, those sorts of activities. Certainly from a lifestyle point of view, they do, that's well regarded. I'm not aware of any scientific or empirical data, but that's certainly well regarded, I believe, by both residents and village operators as being beneficial to those living in these villages. As far as economically beneficial, I think there are a number of ways you can look at that. Obviously, there is a cost of living in villages, but I think that it translates to a higher quality lifestyle depending on what people want. That is obviously what attracts people in the first place. The one thing that I think is overlooked is the equity release when residents move into villages, and this allows them to live at a greater level of financial independence. And I think, as Andrew has said in the past, that the way that the villages operate, it's really like the payment at the end is really like the final payment for entry into a village, or like a deferred payment. So it gives the residents the use of the money and an equity release whilst they're living in the village for that time, which they then pay back when they leave. So I think in terms of providing some financial flexibility, that is a bonus. That is something that's seen and widely recognised. And there's certainly lifestyle and personal benefits to residents living in those villages.
Yeah. Yes, and I'd probably add to that, there's a benefit to the broader community because it releases housing stock that is probably underutilised, where you've got a single or a couple rattling around in the big old family home, and if they move into a village, it releases that housing stock for new families, younger families to take it up. So I think there's an enormous benefit from a community perspective, broader community perspective.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that answer. It was very comprehensive. Andrew, can I ask you one more question here? Is there potential for a multi-generational community, or do regulation prevent such kind of developments?
The Retirement Village Act, and this is state by state in Australia, there's not a total prohibition, but there is an intent that people be over the age of 55, and certainly the contracts that we have with our residents, that's the case. Whilst we say anyone over the age of 55 is welcome, in fact, probably the average entry age is closer to 70. But could there be a successful multi-generational village? It's not something I would pursue. I don't think it would work. There's been attempts in the past to do specialised retirement villages, say for I've had people come and say, could you build a retirement village, Andrew, for past Essendon Football Club players and supporters? And my answer to that is no, because I want to sell to everyone over the age of 60, not just Essendon football players over the age of 60. So it makes no sense to constrain the market in which I'm selling into. So they're sort of nice ideas, and multi-generational, it's a nice idea, but I think the main reasons people move in is they actually want to be around people who are interested in doing the things they're interested in doing at their particular point in age and stage in life. So look, it's never say never, but it's probably something I wouldn't attempt as a developer of a village. I think it would just be a very small part of the market and probably not economically viable because of that.
Right, okay. And how has COVID-19 impacted decisions of senior Australians to move to retirement villages?
Yeah, really good question. I think, well, right now, Melbourne's under lockdown, so for me it's a disaster. They can't come out, they can't look at the display units in the villages, they can't look at anything. So, there's nothing to sell, if you like. It's very difficult. However, what it has definitely highlighted to a lot of people in our target market is that they really have experienced true isolation now. If they thought they were isolated, because the local street had changed in recent years, well, they really feel isolated now because they've literally not been allowed out of their home. And that sense of community and connection, I think you'll find has really made people bring forward their decision to move to a village, because if they were thinking about it in the past, the reasons that generally drive people, which is community, sense of connection, a little bit of support, those things have been very boldly put in front of them now. And I expect, when things loosen up soon after COVID, that there'll be quite a significant uptick in people wanting to move to retirement villages to capture those benefits.
Sam, can I ask you, we read in the press as well as media that the house prices have been softening, or the housing market is softening. Has this also affected the downsizing decision and the demand for units and retirement villages?
Look, that's an interesting question. Winter's traditionally, and Andrew will probably have a view on this, but winter is a traditionally quieter time for villages selling because the elderly, the cohort that are buying into retirement villages typically prefer not to go out in the cold. They will typically choose to go and look at villages at a warmer and better time of the year, and they're happy to be out and about. I think certainly we've had a few different experiences, and again, these are from speaking to village operators. Certainly this second lockdown in Victoria and the hotspots in Melbourne and Mitchell Shire have impacted quite significantly on inquiry. I know I was speaking this morning to a sales manager from one of the large national groups, and I was told that the reservation rates on these multiple villages across Victoria are now down to 3 to 4 a week, whereas they would typically be expecting at this time of year in excess of 8. So there's been a fairly strong impact there. I think that in the first lockdown, what we did have was some people thinking that this will be a relatively short-term experience, and they were even looking at villages as a safe haven or a safer destination, and felt that if they were going to be locked down, well, perhaps being locked down in a village might actually be a better decision. I know a few villages, and including the high-end, the premium sector, were experiencing some pretty strong sales across May and June. But I think this second round has impacted. I don't know that it necessarily impacts on immediate value. I think that will be driven by perceptions and reality of people being able to dispose of their own family home. So if the home that they've lived in for 40 years is harder to sell or has to take a longer period of time, then that will be what flows on to values in villages. At the moment, we've had a fairly benevolent approach by our banks and by the benefit of things like JobKeeper, so that the harsh reality hasn't perhaps yet hit. It's potentially likely to be a different story once banks start to look at loans in a more critical situation, or with a more critical view on affordability. And if people have lost businesses or lost jobs, that will be a reality that at some point in the future has to be dealt with. And that's when I think there'll be some greater impacts to the residential markets and then potentially flow on possibly to villages. At the moment, what we're probably just seeing is extended days on market. If you look at the clearance rates, they are slower, but a lot of the sales that are occurring are being sold either before auction. Our rolling 12-month clearance rate is just under 75%, according to the REIB, which came out in July, and we've had a slightly different variation on days on market, but at this stage it hasn't really, I think, hit to the full extent that it might. And that said, I think it's going to be different across different markets. So more affordable markets may potentially be more resilient. There's more people seeking property at those levels. Potentially the higher end markets at varying levels may suffer slightly greater contagion, but that remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Sam. Andrew, can I ask you, given that there is a slowdown in the market, has that changed the marketing strategy for you?
Enormously, but probably not the slowdown, or the cause for the change is more about not being able to get people to come and visit our villages. So we launched, we're doing a village just out of Geelong at a place called Armstrong Creek, and we launched our display units about a month ago, and we couldn't, people weren't allowed to come to the village, so we did a Zoom tour. It was quite bizarre. It was interesting. I I think it's going to change a little bit about the way we do things in the future. But I literally had a camera crew follow me around the village as I walked through and showed people through the various highlights of the display units, and then we took questions and answers like we are now. So, and the nice thing about it was we also recorded that, and we've been able to cut that into small video clips that we can post on Facebook and the like. So look, it's definitely, we've had to change the way we're doing our marketing. Normally we would have a monthly lunch where we would invite people with reserved units to come along, have lunch, and sit next to people who are already moved into the village as a way of getting people over the line and get them comfortable with the village ahead of moving in. Well, we can't do any of that at the moment, so we're doing lots of other things. We're sending people a little package of tea bags and biscuits, and then we FaceTime them. We take them on a tour on FaceTime. So there's a whole lot of things we're having to do now. I'd have to say there's nothing like as good. Like it's not ever going to sell a house or a unit as easily as having someone there and showing them through in the flesh. But what do you do? That's we just got to come up with new ideas, and there's a need there. But really, I think at the end of the day, most people still want to come and touch it and feel it before they'll buy it.
I think that's absolutely right. Sam, I have another question. This is about the model retirement village. The question is that, do you see potential for naturally occurring retirement communities, for example, higher density apartments outside of the retirement village regulation, for example, through the BTR model or build to rent model?
Look, it's interesting. That is an interesting question. I'm actually already looking at that with a couple of clients who are looking at in premium locations, vertical developments, and so independent living apartments, and they're toying up whether or not they actually want to operate within the retirement villages or under the Retirement Villages Act, or whether they want to do a conventional development, and how they can do things like fund some modest concierge services and take into account things like capital replacement and capital maintenance. So that is certainly something that some market or developers and market participants are looking at. That said, I think that for the reasons I outlined before about equity release, there's a very strong place, and I think it's unlikely to be taken, to be excluded or to be taken away in any within any reasonable period of time in terms of operating as a conventional retirement village. But there are certainly people who are groups that are looking at alternatives to that. And you've seen a little bit of that with the way the big operators are offering different contract types as well. So some of the bigger groups are giving incoming residents a potential to vary the way they buy their units, so they can prepay at a higher level and receive all of the funds back, for example, giving the additional capital to the operator to use over the length of their stay, and then they receive that full amount back. There are a number of variations on that which are outside the conventional way that villages operate. But to answer the question simply, yes, we are seeing that. We're seeing it certainly in Sydney and Melbourne, and I think there've also been some variations on some land lease communities that have chosen to operate without exit fees, so they're trying to just work on a straight site rental, but that's not strictly speaking a retirement village. But there are a lot of variations on the way accommodation is offered and how it's presented to the market, so that people do have a lot of choice.
Right. Thank you very much. Andrew, could you tell us more about locations where the demand for retirement villages has seen an increase, and why do you think that's changing?
Yeah, okay. I think traditionally you would say, and that's still pretty true, most people that move into retirement villages are really moving from within a sort of 10-kilometre radius from where they've always lived. The reasons they might move further afield from that sort of 10K radius would be usually to chase children and grandchildren. So they might move interstate for that. They might move interregionally or to the other side of Melbourne or the other side of Sydney because their children and the grandchildren have moved further away. Generally, metropolitan areas have been more prevalent as from a locational perspective. I think that's just a function of there's more people in over 60s, over 65s bracket. I remember in the past, if you can imagine, most village residents come from within a 10K radius. Actually, the guy that taught me about this industry 15 odd years ago, this was something he was very strong on. You've got to target your market within that 10K radius. And I remember taking him a potential site down on the Bellarine Peninsula on the coast. And it looked like a great site to me. It was near the shops, it was near transport, it was terrific. And he said, but Andrew, you remember I told you, all the residents that were going to get here are going to come from this 10K radius. He said, the only problem with this site you've got is that half of the residents, they're fish. And I've always remembered that, but, because you really cut half your market out when you do that circle around the site. However, there has definitely been a shift around the Melbourne market anyway to sea change and maybe to some extent tree change villages becoming successful. We've got ourselves now 4 villages, 3 on the Mornington Peninsula and 1 on the Bellarine Peninsula, where I thought perhaps half of our residents might have been going to be fish, but in fact they're not, and they've been incredibly successful. So I think that's changed. The location, probably there's less emphasis now just on metropolitan areas, and it's now quite feasible to look a little bit broader into regional areas. But essentially, I think the bigger market is where most of the people are.
Right. Okay. And how has the management of retirement villages changed due to COVID-19? There's a lot of talk around aged care, but we are not touching upon that. But how has it changed the management of retirement villages?
Look, not a great deal, to be honest. It's our operations at a village are about running. There's an on-site manager, there might be an on-site active health coordinator or community coordinator, some maintenance staff. All of those things continue. So whilst we've had to close our clubhouses down to some extent, or at the moment completely, you've still got to run the pool filter. So you've still got to run, the grass still grows and all the maintenance issues still continue. So from an operating perspective, you've got all the normal stuff. Perhaps, there's obviously less social activities and perhaps physical exercise activities going on because the clubhouses are closed. But on the other hand, there's an enormous amount of work that the operations and management people are having to do to manage, the COVID stuff, which is, making sure there's hygiene, more wipe downs, educating the residents on what they can and can't do, to some extent policing what they're doing so that they're not congregating, even though they're in private streets around the village, they're not congregating in groups of 10 or 20. So, there's a bit of, COVID stuff that the operations people have had to add on to their day job, but essentially the day job hasn't changed much at all.
Right. Would you think that the design and development of retirement villages would also change going in the future?
I don't think so because of COVID. No, I think generally there's continuing evolution. I mean, 30 years ago we used to build 8 square bed sits, with a parking space down the back of the village. Now, in our villages, we wouldn't build anything less than a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom, double garage, freestanding, 180 square metre house. That evolution's been going on forever. But I don't really see any great change in the product design that will result out of COVID. No.
Right. Okay. And has there been any changes to the operating cost of retirement villages for the operators, given that there is more requirement about cleaning and social distancing and so on?
No, not really. I mean, some operators have had to absorb a little bit of extra costs. It's a temporary thing. There's a little bit of freed up time because organising social activities isn't there at the moment. So the managers have got some freed up time to organise and and do these COVID related things. And there's small cost increases with perhaps cleaning products and cleaning services. But generally speaking, no. In fact, we would normally increase the monthly service and maintenance levy once a year, perhaps by CPI, consumer price. But I don't think that's going to happen this year. It wouldn't go down well if operators tried to put large levy increases through this year when there's clearly a reduction in the availability of clubhouse services. Not that it's the operator's fault, but I think it'll be a brave operator to try and put prices up for service and maintenance levies this year.
Right, thank you very much. Would you see more oversight and regulation coming your way, and would there be changes to insurance or OHS requirements?
Well, the Retirement Villages Act get reviewed constantly, and because we're regulated on a state-by-state basis in Australia, it's it's a continual circle where one state will be reviewing and make some changes. That'll prompt the next state to do a review and some more changes. So the regulations are constantly being tweaked and changed. One of the real risks in doing that is because inevitably some stakeholders, particularly resident groups, might be seeking more for less, I guess is a good way to describe it. When you increase levels of regulation, you take away choice. And so if we can trust our industry, as I think we can, to self-regulate, self-accredit, which we do, we have accreditation systems, and generally do the right thing in the way we treat our residents and run our villages, then lighter regulation is better than heavier regulation because it lets us provide choice. If we've got flexibility in our contractual arrangements and they're not heavily regulated, we can offer, as Sam was saying before, we can offer different financial models. So that some people want to pay more upfront and less when they leave. Other people would rather pay less upfront in the knowledge that they're going to have to pay a larger exit fee when they leave. So regulation is not necessarily a good thing. It generally reduces the level of choice for residents. From COVID, I don't see it dramatically changing regulation just because of COVID.
Okay, thank you very much. Sam, I have a question for you. Retirement villages use a range of payment options and contractual agreements for residents, which involve ingoing, ongoing, outgoing cost and exit entitlements, which for some is quite complex. Is that model changing in some way? Is it becoming much more simplified given the current situation and where we are in terms of property cycle?
Yeah, look, I think the industry has responded to criticism about some contracts, and it is offering people greater choice. I think that we're seeing that, and the degree at which a particular type of contract will be picked up or will be popular with incoming residents depends on a lot of things, depends on the market position of the village, but it also depends on the incoming resident point of view about the future economy and property market. So I've got a client that has a couple of regional villages which offer a fairly simple choice of two different contracts. One is a fairly conventional deferred management fee structure that operates on a percentage per annum based on the resale price, and the other one has a very low percentage per annum but takes all of the capital gain. And the way that and I'm having valued that a few times, what I've been able to and talk to the residents and manager, what I've been able to determine is the contract that gives away the capital gain will be popular when the expectation of capital growth is fairly modest or fairly low. If we're in a roaring property market, people want to have a piece of that, so they will enter on the exit fee that allows them to share the capital gain. So I think there's a number of things. I think it depends on what the market position is, and certainly where you have a very high-end product. So, you know, there are some villages around Australia that are operating or that are selling certainly up to around the $3 million per unit mark. There's resistance at the traditional levels of deferred management fees. So residents coming into those villages aren't really going to be wanting to pay nearly a third as a maximum exit fee of that kind of amount. They're fairly clear about that, and there's market pushback. And so alternatives will be popular where people can retain their capital at that sort of level. So look, I think there's no one size fits all, but there has been greater response from the industry, and I think that's a good thing. Residents are certainly able to make a choice. In a lot of instances, the conventional structures are still popular for the reasons we've spoken about before. But I think no one minds having the option of choice. I think it's a good thing. It allows people to operate in circumstances that suit their own individual situation. And I think that the industry will continue to respond to what residents want, because they're in a highly competitive sector, and they want to make sure that they get residents continuing to come into their villages and maintain the market position of the villages. So it's and we see this time and time again when we come to look at villages, that with a mature village, there will be a history of different types of resident agreements that have been in place, and you can almost you can actually determine when they changed and what impact that has had on pricing and on things like days on market and when residents have entered and the age at which they enter. It's very interesting to look back over the life of villages and see that. But it's certainly responding and changing over time.
Right. Robert Stimson's hand. I can't good idea to post your question. Is there an echo?
Yeah, I didn't quite get.
Right. Okay. So let me possibly see if I can reduce the echo. Andrew, there's a question for you.
Let's move back a bit, Push.
Yeah. There's a question for you, and this is for a viable retirement village model. Is there a minimum number of units that would need to be developed, or is there some kind of no?
That's a good question. Yes, there's an economical and an efficient sort of threshold. Traditionally, it was probably a bit smaller. Nowadays, we will try not to build a village under 200 units. It's a bit of a trade-off. You need to get enough units in a village so that when you work out the service and maintenance levy, you've got enough units to divide that cost so that it's a really affordable levy. Under the Retirement Village Act, there's no profit to be made. You're not allowed to, it's a cost recovery exercise, the service and maintenance charge. And generally speaking, the cost of running a retirement village is pretty much fixed regardless of size. So if you've got a budgeted cost to run a village, it's obviously a lot better for residents if you're dividing that number by 200 units rather than 100 units. So we do have some smaller units just where we've not been able to get sufficient land size, but the best model for us in the kind of bulk end of the market, not the high end, not the low end, but where the big bulk of the market is a broadacre village would be 8 to 10 hectares of land, 200 units with a 1,000 to 1,500 square metre community centre in the centre. That'll work really well because it'll make the levy affordable when you divide it by those 200 units. And it's a bit of an irony is that mostly people when they move to a village, they can afford to pay an extra $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 on the entry price. What they perhaps can't afford is an extra $5 or $10 on the weekly service levy. and that's because they're on an annuity or a pension or a fixed superannuation annuity. And so the operating cost becomes and the levy that residents pay becomes a really important part of the decision when they move in, because they've got to be able to afford to move in. Okay, they sell a house, they buy a villa and release some capital. That'll supplement their living costs, but more importantly is that those weekly or monthly service levies that they pay to live in the village have got to be really affordable.
Right. Okay. That sounds good. Sam, there is one question for you, and the question is: to what extent sustainability has been embraced in the retirement village development and operation?
Look, sustainability has been considered by a lot of developers. I mean, it's very typical to go into a new village and see Green Star Category 6, different measures. It's quite common to see things like rainwater tanks used for grey waters. I know there are villages in Melbourne that have the purple pipes for reusing grey waters. They have solar, hot water and photovoltaics. It's certainly embraced it, and the idea being to keep, as Andrew's alluded to keep the recurrent charges as low as possible. And just on the point that you raised earlier with Andrew, there are a number of operators who are looking to try and work out how to offer prepayment of recurrent charges. We don't see it widely yet, but there are some villages that operate with the option of allowing residents to prepay. There are certainly some that are allowing residents to come in and have the rate at which they pay recurrent charges fixed for life. So in other words, if you're in there for 10 years, you're only ever going to pay the same amount. The difficulty with that is making sure it starts off at an affordable level. But sustainability is certainly something that's important to a lot of people. And I think from a marketing point of view, residents want to feel that they're doing the right thing moving into a village. And that can be as simple as things like sharing some facilities or giving up a motor vehicle because they're getting to a point where they don't want to drive, they don't want to have the cost, and they can get the village bus into the shops and rely on that. And if doctors come to the community centre once or twice a month or whenever it is, they can access doctors. So realistically, they're conscious of that, from not only from a cost point of view, but also from an environmental point of view. It's quite common to hear about how residents moving into villages are conscious of that, and they want to leave a better place for their grandchildren, and they're keen to maintain things and have units built in a way that that facilitates that. So you'll often see very well insulated dwellings. You'll see a number that have things like double glazing to maintain affordability and just, keep heating costs down. All those sorts of things are a set criteria or are considered by residents entering villages.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll ask you one question which has come through from the participant. Do you see an increasing preference for retirement village residents to remain in their retirement village home and bring in care as their needs increase, rather than move into an aged care due to COVID-19 issues that one is experiencing at the moment?
Sorry, was that a question to me or to Andrew? I wasn't sure.
I posed it to Andrew, but either of you can answer that.
Well, the only thing I'd say is that it's just under, I think, about half of the villages in Australia offer home care of some sort, and that's a trend that's increased in recent years. So it is something that I think operators are conscious of and wanting to help residents stay in their own units in a village for longer. But I'll pass it over to Andrew.
Yeah, I think it's been very much an increasing trend in the last 10 years. As I was saying earlier, I see the local council or the village, local nurse service coming into our village all the time. We don't ourselves provide home care services because, as I was saying earlier, it's regulated at a Commonwealth government level, and it requires a whole lot of registration and regulation. But it's definitely a trend. We've tended to deal with or to provide that service by co-locating or encouraging an aged care operator to co-locate next door to our village. So in some instances, we've carved off a piece of our retirement village land and sold it specifically to an aged care provider who might then develop an aged care facility on it, and from that facility can then provide in-home care services over the fence to our retirement village residents. So definitely the in-home care service is becoming more and more prevalent within a village. People are staying longer. I'd say nowadays people stay in villages on average for 12 to 15 years, whereas in the past it might have only been 8 to 10 years.
Right, okay. And Andrew, can I ask you another question? Would recently announced home builder grant make a difference to the cost that potential residents in the retirement village face?
Yeah, it's a great question, very topical. Unfortunately, no. We thought we had convinced the Commonwealth as an industry through the Property Council, which I'm part of. We thought we'd convince the Commonwealth Government to make the home builder grant available to residents moving into newly built retirement villas. So that it's not just a first home buyer grant, but it could also be a last home buyer grant. And the purpose of that home builder grant was to encourage construction activity, and that's what we do. The Commonwealth Government basically said that retirement villages could be included, but then they put in a qualification that the incoming resident needed to be on the title of the property that the villa sits on. And nowadays, there's very few retirement villages that operate on a strata title basis. Most retirement village operators sell a lifetime lease because it saves stamp duty. So it's not possible for us to have each individual resident on a title on the land on which their unit sits. We don't subdivide villages anymore. So it was really disappointing, to be honest, because the government said, yes, we see this as a good way of encouraging construction, and then they put a condition in there that made it impossible for our residents to access the builder grant. So really disappointed in the end because it would have been beneficial to our residents. It would have served a purpose that the government was trying to achieve, which was to encourage construction, but in their wisdom, they made it impossible for us, for our residents to access it.
Right. Could you also tell us the challenges that hinder retirement villages becoming alternative investment class for investors?
There's a topic that could last a while. It's a challenge. We've really got to educate institutional investors in our industry much more than we have. There was a period about 10 or 12 years ago where our industry moved from being, more cottage-based, family-owned, small villages, and about 12 years ago, the likes of Stockland, Lendlease, and others entered our market, buying up incumbents within the industry, private operators, larger private operators. Unfortunately, they didn't buy well. They overpaid. It was probably a high point in the property market. They probably thought, developing and running retirement villages is not much different to doing a residential subdivision or a master plan community. It's a lot different. Building and selling retirement units is easy. The hard bit is actually managing the villages going forward. And I think that was underestimated by a lot of the larger groups and institutions who sought to come in to this segment of the property market about 12 years ago. But having said that, there's enormous logic in the likes of life insurers, superannuation funds, sellers of annuities owning retirement villages, because they're all in the business of providing annuity stream incomes to their clients. If you're a Challenger, for example, sell annuities to people in retirement. The most incredibly logical asset for a Challenger to own is a retirement village, because we develop annuity stream income for those funds. Every time someone leaves a village, we earn an exit fee, and we'll do that in perpetuity, because as sure as night follows day, people will enter and exit villages, either to exit to go to aged care or death. So we have this enormously valuable annuity stream income, which would sit very logically as a complementary asset for a life product or annuity product seller to own. Now, so far we've not been very successful in attracting those sort of businesses as owners of retirement village businesses. I think it'll come, because the logic is there. One of the things that those institutions struggle with is what I call the current affair risk, which is the risk that a dissatisfied resident might say, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, I'll go to a current affair and you'll be on TV, and so the reputational risk that these institutions rightly concern themselves with is something that I don't think they understand fully, nor know how to manage properly when those situations arise. And it's a very small proportion of residents that aren't happy. I mean, in any community, you're never going to have everyone happy all of the time, and you will always have a small number who will never be happy. And you have to deal with that in a very human but firm and fair way. And if you deal with those people's issues in a firm, fair and consistent way, then what I call the current affair risk is mitigated. So we do have to educate institutions on how to deal with those risks, so that they don't perceive them as massively detrimental to their reputational risk. But I think there's going to, in the future, inevitably, it will become an asset class that institutions that I've described will be interested in owning.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Sam, can I ask you one question? This is probably coming out of more from what is happening in the aged care rather than retirement village. What are the challenges, do you think, that governments at different levels, they would need to address to bring confidence back in the retirement villages?
I don't know that confidence has actually been massively lost. I think, we've seen some operators experience that current affair event, as Andrew suggested, and that's where pricing or contracts are out of balance. If residents are comfortable that the ingoing price is balanced and reflects reasonable value for money, if they're comfortable that the product is what they want to live in and the environment offers them what they want, and they're comfortable that the brand is a brand that will deliver what they seek to, and they believe they're dealing with an operator of some reputation, then in most instances there's no reason why the villages don't sell well, and stock when they come up resell quite comfortably. So I think the challenges for government will be to maintain a degree of oversight without constricting the industry to a point where it's not worth operating in that sector, or where it becomes too involved in compliance and it just becomes full of red tape. I think what you've got to remember in a way is that retirement villages are still independent living. So people come in, they live their own lives, they're happy to participate as part of a community. But this is not like someone who is very frail and aged, who goes into aged care needing nursing care. People going into retirement villages are typically those who, although they're aged and they want to downsize and want to have less maintenance around the house, or those sorts of drivers perhaps. There's still people who have an active social life. They'll go out and see their friends and family. They'll go out to restaurants. They'll do their own shopping. They'll come and participate in the things they choose to that the village operates. But there's still individuals who are capable of making their own decisions. So I think that in terms of regulating, it's important to remember you're still dealing with adults who are, certainly when they're entering the village, at a point that they are able to make their own decisions. I think the market is pretty pretty adept at working out what villages offer those sort of good quality products or offerings, and they're pretty adept at working out those that don't. I recall, without naming it, a village that had a substantial stock problem, and it sold to a not-for-profit group. Within 2 weeks, about a third of that stock problem had been solved, because what happened was the market that was considering buying, and they didn't have confidence in the brand, and as soon as the not-for-profit group came in, they felt confident in that brand. It was a well-known brand, and they were happy to buy into villages. So I think the market, and by this I mean residents looking at villages, is fairly well attuned. I think they are becoming every year more and more capable and more aware of the sector and of what they should be looking at. They're very well educated. There's the Retirement Villages Resident Association that's active and attends a number of the sector conferences. I think regulation is a very different environment. In independent living is in a very different environment, very different context than, for example, aged care. I mean, aged care is really dealing with people who are typically older than 80, who require typically an assessment on their needs, and they're governed by the federal legislation. As Andrew's mentioned before, independent living, typically people who are over 55, although the reality is older than that, but self-funded and still making decisions about how they choose to live. So it is a different environment, different context. That said, retirement villages are probably a sector that have seen some, I guess, cherry picking of different legislation from other states, and I think that trend, so the continuation of bringing different state legislation to a more of a sense of continuity, is likely to continue into the future.
Thank you very much. I'm cautious of time, and my last question to you both, Andrew, to you first. What is the future outlook for retirement villages in Australia post-COVID-19?
Yeah. Look, I think it's probably stronger than ever, because COVID, if anything, has highlighted and emphasised the vulnerabilities of older people that drive them to consider a retirement village. Things like isolation, fear, security, maintenance costs. Being able to do maintenance, all those sort of things have been highlighted and emphasised through COVID. So I think that's going to improve the outlook, if anything. I think we're going to see quite a big uptick from here on in the attractiveness of villages for people over the age of 60, say. It's probably an area we're going to have to get better and better at what I would describe as truth in marketing. I don't think our cohort that we market to, they've been around the block a few times. They're not stupid. You can't put up some nice, slick, fancy pants marketing campaign these days and think that that's going to sell units. You've got to speak to the points that are driving people's decisions, and that might even be negative points like, we know you're isolated, we know you're fearful for your security. There is an alternative where those sort of worries and concerns can be addressed. And I think that sort of honesty in marketing is probably going to be a part of the future of how we take our products to the market. But yeah, I see a pretty positive and rosy outlook. There's a lot of, we've got the baby boomers coming through and they've only really just started entering that age bracket.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Great to hear. And Sam, would you like to add to that?
Look, I agree with Andrew. I think we will see some continued segmentation. So we'll continue to see villages operate, and everything from high-end vertical in premium inner urban locations to the more traditional positions in the newer communities as they're developed on the fringes and in regional areas. I think we did touch on this earlier, but it's interesting to note that in some of the areas that have traditionally been destinations for people on holiday, from, for example, Melbourne, I'm thinking here of the Bellarine Peninsula, some of the successful villages in those locations have been attracting at around 20% of their incoming residents from the Melbourne metro, which is, I think, a really strong vote of confidence in those locations. So people are thinking, well, as they retire, they no longer need to be in Melbourne. That location is close enough for them to be near family, and it's an area that they're comfortable with, they're familiar with, and they've always enjoyed as their family has grown up. So I think those kinds of decisions are going to continue. We've seen, as we mentioned earlier, we've seen some differences in contract offerings, and I think things like prepayment of recurrent charges will come in, as well as probably an evolution or expansion of the types of contract choices that are on offer from various villages. I think there are certainly some villages that do a very good job of attracting residents who are keen on particular activities. I know there's a village on the Bellarine Peninsula that's got its own 9-hole golf course, and not surprisingly, a large number of residents who enter that village are keen golfers, and that all makes sense. So I think the segmentation will potentially continue to improve. I know there's a village in Adelaide that's right across the road from, or across a pathway from a marina, not far from Port Adelaide, and that's obviously popular for people with boats. We're seeing those sorts of activities supported by offerings like villages acquiring their own fishing boats at villages that are near the water, so that residents go through an induction process and can have access to that with a group if they go out fishing on various days, and those sorts of things, like changing the offering so it's not just about the real estate, it's much more about the lifestyle and what residents can have access to is important. There are also some groups that are looking, some of the big groups are looking at offering access to come and stay at various types of vacant stock. So the older serviced apartments in different villages can be used as temporary accommodation if residents want to come on a holiday in a different location, which would be relatively low cost. So there's a lot of things that are under consideration. I think those are all worthwhile. And in many ways, the retirement village operators are actually very responsive to what the markets want, because without providing what people want, they're not going to be in business. I think it's going to continue to meet a section of the community, and I think it's got a strong future.
Thank you very much, Sam. I'd like to thank both the panelists for their time. We have many questions which we could not take up due to paucity of time here, and my apologies. And thanks to all the participants for such a lively discussion and participating in the webinar. And we would look forward to see you at our next webinar in August. Thank you, Andrew, once again, and Sam. We couldn't see you, but we could hear you well.